Order. Gregory Stafford to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered UK-China relations. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mrs Liu-Buck. I welcome this opportunity to raise the opportunities and implications of our relationship with China in this House. At the outset, I wish to declare an interest as a member of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, alongside other colleagues in attendance today, who have consistently raised concerns over the UK's relationship with China. Since Brexit, the UK rightly has sought to establish new economic and trade relationships beyond Europe, aiming to diversify access to key commodities. As a result, China has become the UK's third largest trading partner. This economic interdependence presents both an opportunity and a risk, one that we must navigate carefully to uphold security, human rights and our fundamental values. Yet, we have already seen how economic leverage can be misused. The UK-China economic and financial dialogue in January of this year resulted in a rather uninspiring £600 million deal, hardly the sign of a robust or indeed equitable economic relationship. This isn't a partnership, Mrs Liu-Buck, it is dependency, and dependency makes us vulnerable. Take, for example, the UK's reliance on China for renewable energy components. My right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, made clear in her policy renewal speech last Tuesday that the best way to deliver clean energy and a better environment is with the market. However, the reality is that much of our push for net zero is built on Chinese supply chains, particularly in solar panels, wind farms and electric vehicles. A long-term net zero strategy cannot mean long-term reliance on China. I will.
Would the honourable member accept that if the mechanisms and the safeguards are robust enough to ensure that there isn't slave labour in supply chains, would that not meet his concern?
Gregory Stafford.
I thank the honourable member for the point he raises, and I will come on to slave labour almost immediately in my speech. But to answer him directly, I think the security concerns that I would come on to later in my speech are actually too great that even if, and I welcome the removal of, putting safeguards in to remove slave labour, I think there are still other concerns beyond that we should be looking at. I will.
Of course, that's a wish. It's not a reality. Because right now what we have is no way in which we can ascertain whether they've been buying this from slave labour or not, and there is no punishment available to them right now should they do it. Quite the opposite in the United States, who sanctions companies that have been using slave labour, and that has made a big difference to them. So the government has to get their heads around this, otherwise they're just going to get slave labour-made product all over.
Gregory Stafford.
My right honourable friend, who has considerable and lengthy experience in dealing with China, makes an absolutely crucial point. There's no point having a wish list if there's no sanction or enforcement to back it up. And to give examples of that, I think, that to point out that obviously this trade is tainted by human rights abuses. Over 1 million Uyghur Muslims are imprisoned in a vast network of forced labour camps in Xinjiang, the largest mass arbitrary detention since the Second World War. And despite China's denials, we know that the UK industries, from textiles to electronics, remain dependent on materials from this region. Xinjiang produces between 20 and 25% of the world's cotton and polysilicon, a critical component for those solar panels. And that is why Lord Alton's Amendment 18 to the Great British Energy Bill, securing cross-party support, I might add, was so significant in ensuring our supply chains align with human rights standards. Mrs Liu-Buck, in 1807, on the 25th of March, the abolition of the Slave Trade Act received royal assent. Yet 218 years later, Labour MPs blocked a ban on buying solar panels from China. I will give way to my right honourable friend first, and then...
I just wanted to make a very good speech, but to make the point, it's not just the reality of the human rights abuse. The reason why China uses slave labour, and they came from nowhere 10, 12 years ago, now to be the dominant player in this business, it's because they don't pay them salaries, which makes those arrays cheaper, which means that British companies go rushing over to get them because they are cheaper, and it means the government doesn't mind it too much to a degree because they don't have to pay so much for that. The key is it has to be proper and functional.
Gregory Stafford.
I entirely agree with my right honourable friend, and I will make similar remarks later in my speech, but that's absolutely key. Not only is it the slave labour, but which should be enough to get this government to start thinking seriously about this, but it's also a complete undercut of our market. I give way to the right honourable gentleman.
Thank you. He's been very, very generous with his time, and the right honourable member takes the word out of my mouth almost. Is it not critical that the exclusion of slave labour from the supply chain of solar panels particularly not only excludes slave labour on its moral terms, but also enables companies to compete with the market in a fair way, and ensures that alternative producers in Europe, South America, North America are able to compete on a fair playing field?
The honourable member is entirely right, and I think I would be very surprised if there was anyone in this chamber today who doesn't agree with him. The key point is how we move from what I think is relative universal agreement to actual sanctions and enforcement to make sure that we make sure that our manufacturers are competing on a level playing field. I think it's important to do an example of that. In a 2023 report from the Helena Kennedy Centre for International Justice at the Sheffield Hallam University, it noted that in 2020, China produced 75% per capita of global supply of solar-grade polysilicon, and that was manufactured, 45% of that was manufactured in Xinjiang. And that's why the amendment that I alluded to earlier was crucial to cleaning up the supply chains and to prevent the UK becoming core to Chinese consumption. I will in a minute. I just want to make a little bit of progress. On Times Radio, the Housing Minister ensured his, and I quote, absolute guarantee that solar panels for GB energy projects on hospitals and schools will not include slave labour. But as has already been said, without the legal requirements for companies to comply, I would ask the Minister, can she outline how she can be so sure that such labour will not be involved? China's dominance in trade also extends to industrial production. The Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security's report in July of 2023 warned that the Chinese Communist Party had penetrated, and I quote, every sector of the UK economy, leaving us with a £32 billion trade deficit. The consequences of this economic entanglement are already apparent. When a recent shipment from Xinjiang entered UK airports via European cargo, neither Border Force nor the responsible government departments took the necessary steps to intervene. This failure to act leaves our economy exposed and less competitive. Meanwhile, China remains the world's largest carbon emitter, 15 billion tonnes of CO2 annually, powering industries with coal while exporting steel and EVs at artificially low prices. So I say to the Minister, what is the UK doing? I urge her to clarify whether the government is considering similar measures, as my right honourable friend pointed out, that the US is. And if the honourable member across wishes to come in now, I'm happy to give way.
It was just that I was wondering whether you agree that the correct characterisation of the amendment for the GB Energy Bill was actually about stopping the government being restricted from spending on how it spends its money on GB Energy. I mean, if it had been about a whole-of-industry approach where it was stopping both private companies and government from purchasing solar panels that were tainted by slave labour, that might have made sense. But would you agree that the correct characterisation of the amendment was about restricting spending on GB Energy?
Gregory Stafford.
I fear the honourable member is dancing on a head of a pin there, really. I think to be frank, I don't agree with him on that. So I think he should be really clear, and his government should be really clear about what it's actually going to do to... yes, I will, but then after which I will make some progress.
I need to deal with this through my honourable friend. The reality is that the government already accepts something which I worked with them when in opposition, which is to get this position exactly the same in the health and care bill. And so in the NHS, they are not allowed to buy anything made by slave labour. And that encompasses everything. This amendment would have done the same for the health and care bill. So those who say, oh, it's too narrow, there's only one sector of the economy, we've already done it with health and care, and it was Labour that voted for that at the time, and I was rather proud of that.
Gregory Stafford.
And my right honourable friend should be very proud of the work on that and everything he's done to stand up to Chinese aggression, both in terms of trade but also on a number of the other issues that we're going to touch on, I think, during this debate. And so, therefore, moving on to the security and rule of law elements that I have concerns about, economic interdependence is only one dimension of our vulnerability. The UK must also confront China's growing efforts to exert influence and repress dissidents on British soil. The proposed Chinese mega-embassy at Royal Mint Court epitomises this threat. Despite being firmly opposed by the previous Conservative government, it is now likely to proceed, apparently due to lobbying by the Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary and even the Prime Minister. Housing 700 diplomatic staff, this complex could become a hub for transnational repression and espionage, putting at risk Hong Kongers, Tibetans, Uyghurs and Taiwanese individuals who sought refuge in the UK. The brutal 2022 assault on Hong Kong protester Bob Chan in Manchester, perpetrated by Chinese diplomats who escaped justice under diplomatic immunity, should serve as a stark warning to us all. Beyond our borders, China continues its assault on democracy and human rights. Some 2,000 political prisoners remain in arbitrary detention under Hong Kong's draconian national security law. One such prisoner, whom I'm sure we're all familiar with, Jimmy Lai, a British citizen, has spent over 1,500 days in solitary confinement without access to British consular support. The government's failure to assist him speaks of a broader pattern of weakness in standing up to the Chinese regime. I therefore support the bill proposed by the Honourable Member for East Renfrewshire, which would legally enforce stronger consular protections for British journalists detained abroad. And I hope the government would start to support that as well. I will give way, yes.
Thank you. And would the honourable gentleman agree with me that the scale of fear in the Hong Kong community in this country is extremely concerning, and that every aggressive act from the Chinese state, whether it's sanctions, whether it's violence against protesters, whether it's bounties, only increases their fear of the long arm of the Chinese state and of transnational repression, including amongst the Hong Kong diaspora I'm fortunate to represent in Altrincham and Sale West?
Gregory Stafford.
The honourable gentleman is entirely correct, and the more the British government and British agencies allow this to continue, the more that China will believe that he can get away with, and as he says, will put further fear into Hong Kongers and others who are trying to escape the repression of China. Likewise, in terms of international influence, as Chinese domestic repression intensifies, so does its global influence. Its growing control over international institutions, its use of economic coercion, and its unchecked expansion of surveillance technologies all undermine democratic norms worldwide. The UK must be proactive in countering this. Our commitment to democratic values and ethical trade should serve as a counterweight to Chinese authoritarianism. Yet, despite our growing presence in international forums, we've been hesitant to challenge China directly. And I ask the Minister, she must clarify what discussions have taken place between Beijing and ourselves regarding its blatant contradictions on freedom of the press, freedom of assembly and political rights, both in China and abroad. The pattern is clear, Mrs. Lil-Buck. The UK is being drawn into China's orbit, economically, politically and strategically, while turning a blind eye, I'm afraid, to its human rights abuses and security threats. We are not merely facing complacency from this government, we are facing complicity. Whether it's the approval of the Chinese mega-embassy, the failure to act on forced labour supply chains, or the refusal to stand up for British citizens unjustly imprisoned, this Labour government has consistently chosen appeasement over action. The United States, and indeed the European Union, have already taken decisive steps to protect their economies, their security and their values. And I ask the Minister, why is Britain lagging behind? I'll give way one last time.
Thank you again, incredibly generous with his time. Yesterday I was lucky enough to meet with Sebastian Lai, son of Jimmy Lai, obviously being still held in Hong Kong by the Chinese authorities. Does he agree that the government must take every opportunity available to them, every visit, every meeting with Chinese authorities to raise the case of Jimmy Lai and demand that he is released as soon as possible?
Gregory Stafford.
The honourable gentleman is right. I met with Sebastian Lai myself a few weeks ago, and he made similar points to me, which I entirely agree with. I think it is, let's put it in its mildest, regrettable that the Prime Minister has not made this a priority, and I do hope that the government's decision not to engage with Sebastian Lai on this changes rapidly, because if it doesn't, it sends a dreadful message to others who are in similar situations, and once again, as I said to the honourable gentleman opposite, allows China to continue without check. I think, on that point, we must wake up. The CCP does not seek partnership with us, it seeks control. The UK must take urgent steps to decouple from economic dependency, strengthen our national security and reclaim our sovereignty before it's too late. I look forward to the Minister's response and, more importantly, to seeing real action from this government.
Hear, hear.
Remind members, if they wish to be called in today's debate to Bob, the question is that this House has considered UK-China relations. Chris MacDonald.
Thank you, Mrs Lewis. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and also thank you to the member for Farnham and Borden for securing the debate. It's a real pleasure for me to follow him because I want to expand on some of the points that he's made around our dependence in terms of industry and our economy on China. I've worked in China and I have friends in China and here. I'm certainly no Sinophobe, but what I do think is that we need to be clear-eyed about the fact that we are in an economic competition with China. And in the opening speech, the member for Farnham and Borden described this as a relationship of dependency, and I fear that it is in that position, and an interdependent relationship will be fine, but we are certainly more into a dependent relationship. I remember being in China in 2015 at the launch of the 13th five-year plan, and I was really shocked at what I saw. I saw that this was a big competitive threat to the UK, but at that time, President Xi was in London. We'd done a bit of a swap, and he was meeting the Prime Minister here, and the Prime Minister said he was enthused by President Xi's plan for the Belt and Road, and he directed the City of London to fund it. Well, from where I was sat, that seemed like an extremely bad idea, because I was talking to British engineering companies who were told that they would get 3 contracts in China. In the first contract, they would deliver a machine. In the second contract, they'd deliver the drawing. And in the third contract, they would supervise the Chinese company that was then doing the installation on their behalf. Many of those companies no longer exist because they've been competed out of the market by China. And of course, it's the job of the UK government to make sure that we cite jobs in South Wales rather than Wuhan, in Teesside rather than Tianjin. And I fear that over the course of the last couple of decades, we've been too keen to pursue lower cost goods rather than investing in our own industries. And for the industry that I know best, the materials industries, if we look at some of the critical raw materials we need for our future, materials such as gallium, germanium, neodymium, and I apologise to the stenographers from Hansard, I realise it sounds like a Tom Lehrer song, but actually these are incredibly serious minerals that are essential for our future, and most of them China either dominates the mining or actually they have the materials processing capability for about 90% of the global market. And it's important that we consider how we can secure that materials processing in the future. In fact, even just this week, the Chief Executive of Trafigura, Richard Holtham, so this is the world's biggest private metals trading company, has recommended that governments nationalise their metals processing industries in order to compete with China. Certainly.
It's a really critical area he's talking about. It's critical to all of us. What he's describing is best described, I think, sometimes as the oil of the 21st century. Who controls that controls the way we live our lives. But it's an interesting point, because we cannot consider that China is benign on this market, surely, because only quite recently, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, they actually blocked Japan from access to the market. So Japan then set up its own position on this, but that attitude tells you critically what they intend to use this for. If they need to have to deal with countries like the UK, blocking us off would cause us chaos.
Mr MacDonald.
Yeah, thank the right honourable gentleman for his intervention. I think he's exactly right. We heard the Chancellor of the Exchequer just a few hours ago say that economic security was national security. I think you can't divide those two. And we've generally, because of our belief in the free market, we thought that so long as we have a trading partner we can buy goods from, then that leaves us in a secure position. But of course we must ask the question, why? Why does China choose to dominate these markets? And it's simply because it's an extension of Chinese foreign policy. And the same is true on trade as well. The Chinese Belt and Road policy seems to me a deliberate policy to bypass the traditional trading ports such as Goa, Aden, and so on, well, Hong Kong as well, actually, that the UK has historically had a very strong foothold in, and to ensure that China dominates trade routes as well. So the real question is, what do we do about this? The mindset we need to have is China has the first mover advantage in this new industrial revolution. We had the first mover advantage in the last industrial revolution. How could a country have competed with us in the late 19th century? And that's the mindset we need to have. This means investing in our own industries, using our own market to do this. And we can learn from China in this sense as well. We can use our own public procurement and also investing in the industries that we do have. We have a great nickel producer at Clydeback. The Chinese have tried to copy that process. They've been unable to do so. Our Loch Harbour aluminium plant was set up to serve the nation in the late 1920s. It still exists and is worthy of further investment. We have one of the 6 cobalt refineries in Europe located in the UK as well. But what of copper? We can't achieve anything without copper, and yet we have no copper refining capacity in the UK, despite being the 5th largest exporter of copper in the world. These are the issues that we need to take seriously to ensure that we can have an independent economic policy and an independent foreign policy when it comes to China too. It's important for our industries and our foreign policy. I believe it is also important for the communities like the one I represent, where people have relied on good jobs in these industries too, and we should prize those jobs being in the UK. Thank you.
Jim Shannon.
A real pleasure to serve under your chairship. Can I first of all congratulate the honourable gentleman for Farnham and Farnham for setting the scene so very well, and for those who have made interventions have underlined, sorry, I should say, the issue. I won't say underlined. Apologies, gentlemen. Freudian slip. I want to declare an interest as chair of the APPT for freedom of religious belief. I want to address I believe one of the pressing moral imperatives of our time, the systematic persecution of religious minorities in China and its implications for the right to freedom of religion or belief. I know the minister's in her place and understands these issues incredibly well, and I know that when it comes to the answers that the Honourable Lady will give us, she'll have encapsulated our thoughts, and particularly my thoughts in relation to freedom of religious belief. The human right, while enshrined in international law, continues to be trampled upon with impunity by China. If we as a nation truly stand for these freedoms for all mankind, as we should, and I believe we do, we must take a firmer stance against China's systematic campaign to erase religious identity, as the United Kingdom government itself champions forward through its envoy, through its position at the UN, through the G7 and other multilateral bodies. The UK government has acknowledged a firm stance on human rights, including the right to freedom of religious belief, and the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary and the Chancellor, and indeed the Minister herself here today, have all raised human rights issues with their Chinese counterparts. And these concerns must, I believe, be further amplified when discussing the blatant violation of religious freedoms in China. On behalf of all of those persecuted and forgotten, I thank them for their efforts to do so. And today I speak for those who have no voice, and there are a great many in China at this moment in time. However, the Uyghur population in Xinjiang continues to face relentless oppression for their religious identity, and this targeting is part of a broader state-sponsored campaign against religious communities across China, Tibet, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and indeed potentially any other area which are of interest to the Chinese government. It is my hope that the international community will not allow such blatant violations of religious freedom to continue to go unchecked. We have seen China continue to crack down on any form of free expression in Hong Kong. Journalists, activists, religious leaders have been silenced, arrested and forced into exile. Churches and religious organisations have been pressurised to align with the Communist Party's ideology, which is completely alien. To be a Christian, for instance, and to be a communist, it just doesn't work out. The systematic erosion of religious freedom and civil liberties in Hong Kong is yet another sign of the CCP's wider goal to impose absolute ideological control over every aspect of life of everyone in China. Reports have been confirmed that hundreds of thousands, possibly more, have been forced to renounce their faith in so-called re-education camps. Some of those are the Uyghur Muslims themselves who have been asked to re-educate or been instructed to re-educate themselves, forced to pledge loyalty to the Communist Party and to endure physical and psychological abuse. If we stand in this House, I believe we do, for Ford, we must unequivocally condemn this assault on not only the Uyghur people's rights to worship freely, but all people, as it is a direct attack on mankind's faculty of free agency. And it's not just the Uyghur Muslims, it's Christians, it's Buddhists, it's Falun Gong. It's any person who just doesn't happen to conform to what the Chinese Communist Party wants them to conform to. The Chinese Communist Party has moved from a nominal acceptance of ethnic diversity to an active campaign of assimilation excuse me, in Tibet and Xinjiang, where religion is central to culture and national identity. The CCP aims to bring religious practice under total party control, replacing spiritual and personal beliefs with loyalty to Chinese cultural nationalism. The party state is not merely suppressing faith, is attempting to supplant it with its own devotion to the great Communist Party, which they say it is anyway. I was reminded of the Bible, which tells us very clearly, the great will fall and the mighty will be struck down, and their days coming. The right to freedom of religion or belief is the bedrock of a just society and transcends political and economic interests, Madam Chair. The UK cannot stand by as its authoritarian hand passes over what was once a peaceful society, turning every community neighbouring China into an ideological machine like what we have seen operating in North Korea today. Should we allow this to continue, Madam Chair, we will not only have failed those who suffer under this regime, but we will embolden the CCP to expand this repression even further. The time for stronger action is now. The UK has long championed the right to forward on the world stage, yet our response to these abuses, I believe, must be stronger. The UK Government has consistently raised issues and concerns about religious freedom in China with their counterparts, as the Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary and others have made clear. However, it is now time for stronger, more decisive action. I conclude with this, Madam Chair. I call upon Government to take steps to impose sanctions on all individuals and entities, the Honourable Gentleman has said it on numerous occasions, responsible for forward violations in China, and to strengthen UK import regulations to ensure that goods produced through forced labour linked to religious persecution, whether in Xinjiang or elsewhere, do not ever enter our markets. Thank you.
Might be helpful for the honourable member to know that I'll be calling front bench contributions at 5:10. Tony Vaughan.
Thank you, Mrs Lilbuck. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I also want to congratulate the honourable member for Farnham and Borden on securing this important debate. I acknowledge my interest as chair of the all-party parliamentary China group, and I also pay tribute to the work of the Minister for the role that she has played in improving the UK-China relationship and the UK's bilateral relationships with other Asian nations like the Philippines and Thailand. These are the fastest growing economies in the world, and we need to be trading and investing where the economic action is. I participated in a cross-party delegation trip to Beijing at the start of this year, and during this trip it was clear to me that, with my eyes wide open, there is much that the UK and China can cooperate on. The particular focus of the delegation was on how the UK and China can strengthen global AI safety regulations and what learning we should share regarding our domestic approaches to that issue. It was clear to me that the UK and China can also increase cooperation on trade, especially increasing trade in agri-food, life sciences, pharmaceuticals, education and professional services. There is also more that we can do together to tackle climate change, promote biodiversity and strengthen global pandemic preparedness. Yes.
I'm fascinated by this line of, that he's developing. Could you just point to any part of where China is doing anything significant in reducing its carbon footprint?
Tony Vaughan.
Thank you. It's difficult to see how we're going to address these huge global challenges without involving China. I'm not advocating for them, but a fact that's relevant to my honourable friend's question is that they have a hugely fast-growing green energy technology sector. And of course they have huge carbon emissions as well. But for sure, and that's another issue. Yes. Yes.
To answer the honourable member's question, 35% of China's energy is met by renewable energy. That's up from 0 15 years ago. By the end of this decade, they will be responsible for 60% of the globe's renewable energy production at the rate they are expanding.
I'm grateful for my honourable friend's contribution. He's more on top of the statistics than I am. But as a member of the G20 and the UN Security Council, and as the third largest trading partner for the UK, if one includes Hong Kong, it's entirely logical that this government should aspire for a more stable and consistent relationship with China. To do anything different would not, I think, be in the UK's national interests, as without... I will.
way. There are well-documented links between Russia and China that are publicised, well-known by Russia's oil and all the rest of it. We are fighting Russia at the moment in Europe. They are our primary adversary. Why on earth, if that's the case, would we want to have a close and stable relationship with China?
Morning, Yvonne.
As I said, again, I'm not advocating for China. I'm saying that as our third largest trading partner with Hong Kong, we cannot pretend they don't exist. We cannot pretend that there is no role for building a dialogue and engagement. And the reality is that the way that the tectonic plates of global affairs are moving, it is in China's interest that they have a stable Europe. Who else is going to buy their electric cars, for example? And so there is an evolution in the way these things need to be looked at. But I agree with my learned friend's points in general. So I think it's a relevant point to refer to what we've had over the last 14 years. And that is a British foreign policy towards China, which has resembled something of a roller coaster. We've had the golden era under the Cameron government when President Xi enjoyed a state visit and, as the Foreign Secretary recently reminded us, a beer in a pub with the Prime Minister. Then we had the May's government's justified scepticism about Xi Jinping's involvement in Hinckley. And then the Johnson government's confused China policy, culminating with Liz Truss's Cold War 2.0 style policy. Now, no serious nation should aim to have a bilateral relationship with the world's second largest economy that resembles a fairground ride. The Chancellor's trip to China for the economic and financial dialogue in January, concluding agreements of up to £1 billion for the UK economy over 5 years, is an example of how taking a grown-up relationship to China is in our national interest. Yes?
I'm grateful. The Intelligence and Security Committee published a report in 2023 on China, and the public version of it read as follows. It is China's ambition at a global level to become a technological and economic superpower on which other countries are reliant. That poses a national security threat to the UK. Is that how he sees it, or how does he see it, if different?
Well, I completely agree that a national security first approach to China has to be the position. And as I understand it, that is the position of the government. That is why the position that was taken in relation to the embassy is a national security issue. I know that there's been some debate about that, but I'm not in a position to second-guess MI6 and MI5 and the security services about this. And that has to be the lens through which we look at these issues. So I have referred to the EFD outcomes, and I would say this, that critics of engagement overlook the fact that some of the nations who took a robust approach to China were still doing engagement in the background. And there are those who criticise engagement, but if you do it while you're sort of stepping back and your competitors, including the United States, who have taken a robust approach to China, are doing engagement, then we are missing a trick. And it was the UK that hadn't sent a Prime Minister to China in many years. So I'm pleased to see that the government aims to have a relationship with China that is based on what I understand, as I've said, to be a national security approach, while also cooperating, competing and challenging China where we believe it's appropriate. Now, engaging with does not, of course, mean agreeing with. Yes.
I've listened to what the Honourable Gentleman said. I'm very, very conscious of what he's putting forward. But what I don't hear in his conversation or his speech today is anything to do with human rights, anything to do with religious persecution, anything to do with tying in our economic business with China and making sure that these things are central. I believe it's the mission of the Minister. I'm hoping the Honourable Gentleman will come on to that shortly and reassures that's also his thoughts.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and that is exactly what I am now moving on to. And as I say, engaging with does not mean agreeing with. And part of our stable and consistent relationship with China involves stably and consistently raising human rights concerns with them, like the Prime Minister did in relation to the case of Jimmy Lai when he met President Xi last year. And I recently met as well with Jimmy Lai's son, Sebastian, and the barristers representing his father. And I was very concerned to hear of his deteriorating medical situation. And I do urge the Prime Minister to meet with Jimmy Lai's team to discuss what the British government can do to effect his release. Another example is, of course, the compelling evidence of the use of forced labour in energy supply chains in China, especially polysilicon. Now, I do not believe that our green energy transition should be built from solar panels built using forced labour. So we must make sure that we take a whole-of-industry approach which has robust safeguards against the import of solar panels where it cannot be shown that they are free from forced labour. And in the long term, our country needs to become self-sufficient in our industrial supply chains, such as in renewable technology production. And I completely agree with what my honourable friend says about protecting UK domestic industries and jobs, which must be prioritised. A grown-up relationship with China means that you can believe we should work with China on areas that do not impact national security and human rights, while also putting our foot down in areas that do. This will always be a highly complex bilateral relationship with tricky trade-offs and tensions. I fully accept that it's in the role that there is a role for pressing China extremely hard, as those have in this chamber. I'm pleased to see the government's success so far in bringing stability and pragmatism to that relationship. Thank you.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Callum Miller.
Thank you very much, Mrs Lewis-Brooke. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Farnham and Borden for bringing this important debate. On behalf of the Liberal Democrats, I concur with the view expressed in the 2023 Integrated Review that China represents a strategic challenge to the UK, and I quote, across almost every aspect of national life and government policy. And today's debate has been a chance to consider how the government is focusing in meeting this challenge. Suffice to say that from my perspective and that of my party, the answer is at this stage disappointing. I do accept that it's not easy, as the Honourable Member for Folkestone and Hythe just set out. The Conservative Party did lurch from sharing pints with the President of China to designating China as, quotes, the greatest state-based threat to the UK's economic security by 2021. And Xi is able to think strategically, now that he has such control of the Chinese apparatus and think over many years. So the UK does need to do better and to be more constant. We need to be, first, more clear-sighted about the threat that China poses. Secondly, make fuller use of the full apparatus available to us. And thirdly, set out some red lines and show to the Chinese government that breaching those will have consequences. I do agree and accept that the member from Folkestone and Hythe is right to highlight the scale that China has in the global economy, and the Honourable Member for Stockton North also pointing out from his position of experience the importance that it has for UK industry. But we must balance these economic interests with the threat, and it's my view that at the moment the government's position is too accommodating and not sufficiently robust. Of course.
I'm grateful for the Honourable Member for giving way. We may disagree about what we heard earlier on today in the spring statement as to whether the economy is growing or not, but we are certain that this will-o'-the-wisp of growth is something that this government will be grasping at ever more desperately in the months and years to come. Does he share with me that, unlike the member for Folkestone and Hythe who said he went to China with his eyes wide open, that we might actually end up as a country turning a Nelsonian eye to human rights abuse, to the fact that we're exporting our net zero to a highly carbonised economy, and indeed to the cyber attacks we experience daily from China in order to chase after the growth that isn't coming?
Callum Miller.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and I agree on two fronts. I think he and I agree more on our disappointment in today's growth figure than he gives credit for. But secondly, on the point that he makes, the government has set out that it wishes at times to challenge China, at times to cooperate, and at other times to compete. And it's my contention that the government is too intent on cooperation and not sufficiently intent on challenge, as the Honourable Member sets out. I wish very briefly, Mrs Lewis-Brooke, to set out three areas of threat. First of all, in security, and echoing the comments that have been made by others. We face direct threats in the form of cyber attacks. We face the threat that China is an ally to those who are our enemies in the form of China and others. And we see China threatening some of our own allies, including Taiwan, Korea and Japan. Secondly, in the veil of economic vulnerability, we face threats. Many other members have spoken about the dependency that we face. In addition to this, in the terms of the Global South, the regrettable decision by the government to cut the UK's overseas aid budget creates an opening space for China through its Belt and Road Initiative to increase the debt dependency of countries on China and therefore to increase their influence in the world. And also on the economic side, there are very credible reports of China's attempts to steal intellectual property from the United Kingdom, from our universities and tech sector, and I'm concerned the government is not doing enough to stop this. And thirdly, and perhaps... Sure.
the honourable member for giving way. He mentions Chinese theft of intellectual property. Would he also agree with me that it's a concern when we give it away as well? I mean, such as UK universities setting up campuses in China to train Chinese technicians to outcompete British industry, for instance.
Callum Miller.
I thank the honourable member for Stockton North for his intervention. It is a delicate balancing act, as he and his colleagues have articulated. If we wish to have collaboration and cooperation, then information will inevitably flow. The important thing is there is transparency about that and that the right economic benefit is derived from any intellectual property if it is indeed transferred. I was coming to perhaps the third area of threat, perhaps the most important, around human rights and political interference. And other members have spoken about this, so I shall be brief. Like others, I've met with the team supporting Jimmy Lai and his son Sebastian and call on the government to reassure us this afternoon that that case is being upheld. I've also had the opportunity to meet with at least 2 of those in the United Kingdom who, in return for campaigning for real democracy in Hong Kong, have been suffered with bounties by the Hong Kong authorities. I know that Carmen Lau is with us this afternoon. The fact that the Hong Kong authorities see fit to distribute posters and letters to neighbours in this country on UK soil, intimidating those who have stood up for political rights in Hong Kong, is appalling. And I'd like reassurance from the government that much more is being done, and also through our police forces, to identify those potentially within the allegedly diplomatic team of China who have taken this forward. It's critical, Mrs. Lurbach, that we take these items together and see them as part of one entity and have a holistic approach to China. It's my concern that too often the government has treated them in compartments, has spoken briefly about human rights, and then failed to address other issues. And so, just briefly to conclude, Mrs. Lurbach, I'm calling on the government to use the apparatus available to it, to generate a human rights and democracy report, to conduct the audit on China which it had promised, to introduce fully the foreign influence registration scheme and place China in the enhanced tier, and when it comes to the strategic defence review, to ensure that China plays a full part in that. We cannot allow China to dominate our relationship with it. We must see a government that is prepared to demonstrate red lines and the consequences if China does not observe the red lines that we have set out.
Opposition spokesperson Andrew Rossendale.
Thank you, Mrs. Yorbuck, and thank you to my honourable friend, the member for Farnham and Borden, for raising this very important issue today on the floor of the House. It is an important debate that we must have, and UK-China relations is going to be increasingly important as we progress and as the threat of China becomes more evident. So I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions today. It seems like there is a consensus about the threat that China poses, perhaps not entirely unanimous. The member for Folkestone Hive seems to have a slightly different approach. But I do believe that China poses one of the greatest, if not the greatest, threats to our freedom and security, and that's why it's vital that we address this issue today. However, China is a nation with proud history and a rich civilization, deserving respect. But, Madam Chairman, that respect can come only at the expense, cannot come at the expense of turning a blind eye to aggression, human rights abuses and attempts to undermine the international order. The government have announced that they are conducting a China audit, but we have yet to hear what that actually entails. It is not enough for ministers to simply review our policy towards China behind closed doors. The British people deserve transparency, and Parliament deserves answers. So let me begin. If you don't mind, I'm going to make some progress, and then if there's time, I'll come to you. Let me begin with the issue of Taiwan, the Republic of China. Beijing's increasingly assertive behaviour towards Taiwan, including military activity around the island, airspace incursions and naval operations, is a growing cause of concern. And I ask the government, will the Minister tell us, does the UK remain committed to the One China policy? And if so, how does the government intend to balance that position with our strong interest in supporting Taiwan's democracy and the principle that the future of Taiwan should be determined peacefully and without coercion? I believe that the people of Taiwan should have the freedom to shape their own future without the threat of force. So, what steps is the government taking alongside the United States, Japan and Australia to reduce tensions and deter any escalation in the Taiwan Straits? Taiwan is a proud democracy and they deserve to have their freedom and they should not be coerced, and we as an ally of Taiwan should certainly be there standing shoulder to shoulder with them. So next I'd like to say a few words about the Belt and Road Initiative. Now this is a programme that Beijing claims is about infrastructure and development, but which in reality serves as a tool for strategic dominance and debt entrapment. Across Africa, Asia and even parts of Europe, we have seen the consequences of this so-called investment. Developing nations are finding themselves shackled by unsustainable debt, forced to hand over key infrastructure and strategic assets when they cannot meet Beijing's demands. When is the government's strategy? What is the government's strategy to counter this growing influence? How are we supporting our Commonwealth partners and other vulnerable nations in resisting this economic model? And will the Minister tell us what alternative are we offering to the developing world to avoid them being trapped into Beijing's orbit? On Hong Kong, the Chinese Communist Party's flagrant violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration is seriously jeopardising the One Nation, Two Systems framework. Beijing has crushed political opposition, tried to silence free press and criminalised dissent. In light of this, I ask the Minister, what is our long-term strategy for holding Beijing accountable for breaking its treaty obligations? How are we supporting British nationals overseas who have made the courageous decision to leave Hong Kong and settle in the United Kingdom, and who may be at risk of transitional repression? The case of Jimmy Lai stands as a stark symbol of Beijing's assault on press freedom and political dissent in Hong Kong. Lai, a British citizen and a founder of Apple Daily, has been targeted under Hong Kong's draconian national security law for the so-called crime of defending democracy. His prosecution is not just an attack on an individual, it is an attempt to silence independent journalism, intimidate anyone who dares to criticise the CCP's actions in Hong Kong. And I must ask the government, what steps are they taking to protect the rights of British citizens like Jimmy Lai, who are facing politically motivated prosecutions in Hong Kong? So, does the Minister agree that this politically motivated trial must end and that Jimmy Lai must be released? And what is the government's strategy for making the case that the national security law should be replaced? The CCP's human rights abuses in Xinjiang are well documented. Forced labour, mass internment and systematic persecution of the Uyghur population. It is therefore deeply concerning that the government appears to be resisting efforts to block the procurement of Chinese solar panels linked to forced labour under the GB Energy Bill. And I ask the government directly, what assurances can ministers provide that the UK's transition to net zero will not come at the cost of complicity in modern slavery? How will the government ensure that supply chains for renewable energy infrastructure are free from forced labour and other human rights abuses? As the leader of the opposition rightly pointed out in her recent speech, the idea of achieving net zero by 2050 while relying heavily on Chinese technology and supply chains is fantasy politics. We cannot afford an over-reliance on China, as should have been made clear following the pandemic. What steps is the government taking to reduce strategic dependence on China, particularly in the critical industries like energy, telecommunications and rare earth minerals? The proposed Chinese super embassy in London raises concerns about Beijing's growing influence in the UK. The unprecedented size and scope of this facility has prompted worries about potential security risks and pressure on Chinese dissidents. Reports of covert Chinese police stations in the UK add to these fears. Has the government assessed the national security risks, and will they consider restricting or scaling down this proposal? More broadly, what steps are the government taking to prevent foreign powers from using British soil for covert operations or political intimidation? And I want to make the case again, as my party has said before, that China should be on the enhanced tier of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme. And finally, I must also raise the Chancellor of the Exchequer's recent visit to China. What, if any, assurances did the Chancellor seek on human rights during her visit to Hong Kong, the Uyghurs or Taiwan? And how does the government intend to ensure that any future economic engagement with China does not compromise our strategic interests? In closing, Mrs. Liu-Bach, China presents one of the big geopolitical challenges of our age, not just to Britain, but to the entire free world. We cannot afford to be naive. Engagement must be grounded in realism, not wishful thinking. We must work with our allies to check aggression and defend our democratic values. The British people deserve to know where their government stands, and the government must be prepared to act and not just talk.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Liu-Bach, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon here on such a crucial debate. And I thank the honourable gentleman, the member for Farnham and Borden, for securing the debate. And I thank all honourable members for their valuable contributions, and will try to respond to the points raised after setting out the government's strategic approach to China. The government will always put UK national interests first. Our approach will be consistent, long-term and pragmatic. In an ever-changing geopolitical context, our relations are critical in ensuring the UK's resilient growth, maintaining our position as a responsible global actor, and defending our security and values. That means cooperating where we can on issues including net zero, health and trade, competing where our interests differ, and challenging where we must to protect our national security and our values. Engaging with China is both pragmatic and necessary to support our domestic and international priorities, not least because we are global players with large economies and permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council. We must engage regularly to advance our national interests, whether it's on issues of cooperation, like global green transition, or issues where we firmly disagree, like Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's why the Prime Minister met with President Xi at the G20 last year, and the Foreign Secretary held meetings with Foreign Minister Wang Yi in the UK last month and in Beijing last year. The Chancellor and Energy Secretary have also visited China, and I visited Hong Kong in November of last year. Across all of these meetings, the government has pressed and will continue to press the Chinese government on issues which matter to us and to this House, such as calling for the unacceptable sanctions on our parliamentarians to be lifted, demanding British national Jimmy Lai's immediate release. And I've been meeting with Jimmy Lai's family since before the member was elected to this House, and we remain robust in his defence on freedom of speech and defend his family as British citizens. Raising human rights concerns consistently, including Xinjiang, cotton production, solar panels which have been mentioned, calling for the repeal of the national security law and sanctioning Chinese companies over their supply of dual-use and military goods to Russia's military-industrial complex. The stark truth is that under the previous government we did not have the channels in place to pursue and protect UK interests sufficiently to raise these important issues at the highest levels in the Chinese government. Turning to the government's China audit.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way, and thank her for bringing her expertise to the topic. She's highlighted the way in which the government is trying to deepen that relationship with China in the belief that by having a better relationship, we can better serve UK interests. However, I think she will recognise that whether it's in the case of Jimmy Lai or in the bounties placed on Hong Kong activists, we see the relationship going only in one way. Could you say a little bit more about the sticks which the government is prepared to use if it doesn't get the outcomes that we're looking for?
Minister.
Well, what I will say to him is that national security is paramount, and any engagement will be encased in that metal case of national security. Turning to the government's China audit, under the last government, our China policy was inconsistent, as the member for Folkestone and Hythe has said, swinging back and forth from David Cameron's golden era to Liz Truss's confrontational approach, as often as they changed Prime Minister. That's why a team in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office has been conducting the China audit. They have consulted widely across government and a wide range of external stakeholders, including some members in this room who have been in to see the Foreign Secretary and discuss their concerns, which is already proving valuable in developing policies and planning engagement.
Edward Morello.
I thank the Minister for giving way. The China audit itself was due to be published earlier this year. I understand it's now slated for summertime. Would the Minister take this opportunity to confirm when it will be published and, moreover, confirm that the Foreign Secretary is going to appear before the Foreign Affairs Committee to answer questions about it?
Minister.
Well, I can certainly confirm that the audit will be made public before the end of the spring. And certainly dates in the diary with the Foreign Affairs Select Committee are a matter for the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. And anyone who dares to go against the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee will be a very frightened individual indeed. So I'm sure that at any invitation the Foreign Secretary will appear on any topic to speak to the committee. The House will have seen the marked difference between this government, which is working hard to protect and pursue our interests, and the last government which failed to stand up for British interests by having the difficult conversations which are so necessary with China. Now let me turn to national security. Any government's first duty is to keep the country safe, and we remain fully committed to that mission. We've taken strong action through the National Security Act, giving us robust powers to protect our industries and institutions. The UK is clear that attempts by foreign governments to coerce, intimidate, harass or harm their critics overseas, undermining democracy and the rule of law, are utterly unacceptable, and that's why we did invite in some of those B&O passport holders who have personally been at risk by these sorts of disgraceful actions. And that's why our Defending Democracy Task Force is driving a robust and coordinated response across government and law enforcement. Now, the member for Altrincham and Sale West, who is a doughty campaigner for British national overseas passport holders, has made a very important point. And the government is taking a reasonable and proportionate approach to creating secure and resilient growth for the UK. With careful handling, national security and growth can be mutually reinforcing. We will continue to bolster resilience to economic shocks and tackle economic-based threats to national security. And I would ask anybody who has personal experiences and concerned about any B&O passport holder in their constituency to write to me immediately, or to the Minister for Security, the member for Sheffield. Now, growth and economic security, of course, are crucial, and we cannot ignore China, given that it's the world's second largest economy and our fourth largest trading partner. Worth over $110 billion per annum, shows why this partnership is so crucial for UK and global growth. But, as the member for your seat, Stockton North said, it's so important that this growth must be secure and resilient, and he's quite right to point out a number of threats to that, including the public procurement questions, intellectual property and tech, and how that dovetails with our domestic industrial strategy. And as he's aware throughout his role that he has here in Parliament, the domestic industrial strategy will be developed in concert with this China audit. And I welcome very much his experience in understanding the depth of complexity around materials in particular, and look forward to hearing more about his expertise in that area. On climate and net zero, it's also essential that we engage China on global challenges, and climate in particular. As the world's largest investor in sustainable energy, the largest emitter of greenhouse gases and the largest producer of coal, the choices which China makes are critical to global efforts to tackle climate change, not just in China but across the world. On human rights, as ever, the member for Strangford raising issues where we need to challenge China. He is very aware that it is our duty as the government to hold China to account on its human rights record, including its repression of people in Xinjiang and Tibet. And I refer him to item 4, statement at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, fresh off the press, which reflects his concerns on freedom of religion or belief, which he raises in this House on a number of occasions. Let me turn to the UK's long and historic relationship with Hong Kong, and forgive me if I run out of time, Madam Deputy Speaker, Mrs. Lewis-Buck. I hardly need to tell the House how deep and strong our people-to-people and trade links with Hong Kong are, and that's why the Government will continue to stand with the people of Hong Kong. Since the launch of the British National Overseas Visa Route, we've granted over 219,000 applications, and we will continue to welcome and protect all Hong Kongers who have made the UK their home in recent years. The Government recognises the ongoing erosion of rights and freedoms threatening Hong Kong's way of life. Now, briefly on Taiwan, which the opposition spokesman raised, the UK's...
Order. The sit-in stands adjourned.
Cliffhanger. That's Taiwan, isn't it?